Welcome to the podcast, Let the Prophet Speak. Today we are studying the prophet Jeremiah, that's Yirmiyahu chapter 41. This is Saul Weinreb, the host of the podcast. We are in the middle of the chapters that discuss the events surrounding the final destruction of Jerusalem, the exile of most of the people to Babylon, and we just read in chapter 40 about the remaining refugees and escapees and survivors of the war between Babylon and Judea were now gathered under the leadership of Gedaliah, who was appointed by the Babylonians to administer the remaining people of Judah. There is now a small revival of sorts with the support of the Babylonian Empire, with Gedaliah in charge, and the people starting to rebuild whatever they could of what was left. Jerusalem had been destroyed, the temple had been destroyed, but there was some hope to rebuild the people. And we learned that Jeremiah decided to remain with them rather than to join the exiles that were brought to Babylon. This, interestingly, is one of the few chapters in this book that doesn't mention Jeremiah at all. So Jeremiah, in the events of the chapter we're about to read, is more of a participant rather than an influencer of these events. He will come back to his position of influence soon, but in this chapter itself, Jeremiah is there watching these events unfold, but we don't hear from him at all. Now, we just learned that as this new community is starting to rebuild itself under the leadership of Gedaliah, who has sworn fealty to the Babylonian kingdom, and he has asked all of the men to no longer rebel against them, that there was one leader of a group named Ishmael ben Netanya who had conspired with the king of Ammon to assassinate Gedaliah, which would have been considered an extreme affront and rebellious act against the Babylonians who had put Gedaliah in charge. And somehow Ishmael wanted to create some form of alliance with Ammon against Babylon by assassinating Gedaliah. This devious plan, was presented to Gedaliah himself. However, Gedaliah himself refused to believe that someone from one of his own would be so irresponsible and so vengeful as to want to assassinate him, and refused to take any measures of precaution against the potential assassination. The devastating effects of his naivete will now be seen and heard in this next chapter 41. So the holiday of Rosh Hashanah, which is the first day of the Hebrew month of Tishrei, which is the seventh month on the calendar, but it's also the first day of the year. I'm not going to go into a lecture of how the Jewish calendar works now, but this is the holiday of the Jewish New Year, which typically would have been celebrated with tremendous celebrations taking place in the temple itself. This is the first Rosh Hashanah, which now there is no temple. But they still celebrated the holiday, which shows that in Gedaliah's mind, he felt we still need to continue our religion, we still need to continue our practices to the extent that we can without a temple, which sets in place what will eventually become the pattern for the rest of our history of practicing our religion without a temple in place anymore. So, Vayihi b'chodesh Hashvi, this is verse 1, it was in the seventh month. Ba Yishmael ben Netanya ben Elishama, the man Yishmael who was plotting against Gedaliah, came pretending to be at peace. Mizera HaMalucha, he was of royal descent, So he apparently felt that he had some right to the crown rather than Gedaliah, who was not of royal descent. V'Rabei HaMelech, and some of the officers of the king, all of whom had an interest in taking revenge against Gedaliah. But they all came supposedly in peace. And he had 10 men, presumably these are armed soldiers, surrounding him. They came with him, Ito el Gedaliah ben Achikam hamitzpata. They came to the place of Gedaliah, where he had set up his official offices in Mitzpah. And they together sat and they ate bread together and celebrated the holiday of Rosh Hashanah together, as if they were in peace. Then Vayakam Yishmael ben Netanya, after they had eaten and they were full and everyone was sitting and supposedly enjoying a nice holiday meal together, Yishmael, the son of Netanya, Va'aseres ha'anashim asher hayu ito, and the 10 men that were with him, that were in on the conspiracy, they got up, Vayaku et Gedaliah ben Achikam, and they struck Gedaliah, son of Achikam ben Shaphan, Bacherev, they struck him by the sword, Vayamas also, and they killed him. He being the one, Asher Hifkid Melech Bava Ba'aretz, that had been appointed by the king of Babylon to be the governor over the land. So they struck him down. This is a massive move of rebelliousness against Babylon again, which had been disastrous on every time they rebelled in the days of the king Yehoiakim, in the days of the king Tzidkiyahu, and now again in the days when there's no more king but just a governor, again they rebelled. And also they killed the one leader who had already demonstrated the ability to unite the remaining people into some level of coherent society to start to rebuild. They killed him, which is the reason that we're all familiar with the day after the holiday of Rosh Hashanah. We have a fast day to commemorate the death of Gedaliah, who was the last hope for some settlement of Jews in Judea. And all of the Jews that were there with him at Gedaliah B'Mitzpah, that were with Gedaliah in Mitzpah, and there even were Chaldean officers that were there, because remember, they were there to oversee Gedaliah and to be liaisons between Gedaliah and the main government back in Babylon. All of those who were soldiers, Yishmael killed and slaughtered. So in other words, he did not kill the civilians, but he killed all the armed soldiers, along with the killing of Gedaliah himself. So it was an assassination, and then killing anyone who was there who posed a military threat to Yishmael. And it was the next day, the day after, or the second day after Gedaliah was assassinated, V'ish lo yada, yet nobody knew about it yet. The news hadn't spread. The men who would have been capable of running and bringing the news out to outside the city were killed by Yishmael. So at this time, across the countryside where people were celebrating the holiday and were trying to rebuild, they didn't know yet that their leader was killed. So, Vayavo Anoshim Mishchem, Mishilo, Mishamron. Some of the towns that had started to be resettled were the towns of Shechem, the town of Shiloh, the town of Shomron, Samaria. These are towns which were being resettled by the Judeans that remained in the area, and they had been planning on bringing offers and sacrifices to the temple, presumably for Yom Kippur, which is going to follow Rosh Hashanah just a few days later. And they were on their way. They set out originally with the intention to go to Jerusalem, but then they found out that Jerusalem had fallen, and they were mourning terribly. Shmonimish, there was 80 men together traveling. Meguchei zakan, and they had shaved their beards. Ukrei v'gadim, and they had torn their clothes. and they had made cuts in their flesh. All of this in mourning over the disaster that they had heard about. And with them they had offerings of incense and other offerings that they were Lavi Beit Adonai, that they had planned on bringing to God's temple, but unfortunately they found out that the temple was destroyed. They practiced mourning, and the only place now to go, they heard, was there's something brewing in Mitzpah where Gedaliah is. Let's go there and celebrate and commemorate the holiday, presumably of Yom Kippur and the following holiday of Sukkot, together with our new leader, and we'll do what we can. We don't have the temple anymore, but we'll do what we can, and this was their intention. So, Vayetze Yishmael ben Netanya likratam min ha-mitzpah. So Yishmael, who is now presiding over the civilians who he didn't kill, who he has now captured them, and he's holding them in captivity, and all any other he and the men, the soldiers that were with him. So he hears this group of people are coming, so he goes likratam min ha-mitzpah. He leaves Mitzpah down the road to welcome them to the town of Mitzpah, and haloch uvocheh, he is walking and crying as he walked. He's pretending that he's crying, as if he's also mourning the temple just like they were, trying to look in a sympathetic way so that the people would think that he is with them in the mourning of the temple. Vayikif goshotam, so when he meets them, vayomar lehem bo'u el Gedaliah ben achikam. I see that we mourn the temple together, but let's go together to our new leader Gedaliah, and let's try to make something out of what we have. So he pretended to be one of them, and rather, obviously, had he come out with the sword as if he was fighting, it would have been hard for him and his 10 men to fight with these 80 men if the 80 men realized that he had killed Gedaliah. So he needed to dupe them and bring them in as if Gedaliah was still alive. And then as they came into the city, when they were taken completely by surprise, Yishmael ben Netanya, Yishmael then had the opportunity to kill them by surprise, and he slaughtered them el toch habar, into a large pit. Hu v'anashim asher ito. Ishmael perpetrated this horrific murder and crime. He and the men that were with him slaughtered these people and threw them into a pit. V'asara anashim nimtzuvam. Among them, as they were being executed, there were 10 men among them, Vayomru, that begged Yishmael, al timitenu, please don't put us to death, do not execute us. And of course he said, why should I treat you different than anyone else? He says, Ki yesh lanu matmonim basodeh, we have hidden in our fields, back in the towns where we came from, chitim usorim v'shemen udvash, we have wheat and barley and oil and honey. We have supplies, you have need for us, we can help you. Don't kill us. So he held back from killing them, presumably because they promised that they would go back to their places and bring some of the supplies, because Ishmael knew that he and what he planned on being his new kingdom would need these supplies. V'habar, it just so happens to be that the bar, asher hishlich sham Yishmael, the pit where Yishmael threw et kol pigrei anashim, all of the corpses, all of the dead bodies of the people that he had slaughtered, asher hika biyad Gedaliah, that he had killed, and I'm going to translate this, alongside Gedaliah himself. There's other translations, the Dot Mikra translates it this way, and I think it fits the best. The men that he killed, plus along with the killing of Gedaliah, the assassination of Gedaliah himself, Hu asher asa hamelech asa. This is the same pit which the king Asa, way back when, the king of Yehuda named Asa, made mipnei Basha melech Yisrael, during his battle with Basha, who was the king of the northern kingdom. So going back a couple hundred years, he had made this pit this pit was the same pit that Ishmael used to throw all of Gedaliah, the body of Gedaliah, and the body of the men that he had slaughtered. Oso milei Ishmael ben Netanyahu chalalim. This is the one that he filled up with the corpses. Why that's important is not clear. What significance this pit had is not clear. But if anything, maybe just to tell us, the geographical detail, so we should know. But it's not clear why that's significant. So all of the remaining people, the non-soldiers that had come to celebrate Rosh Hashanah together with Gedaliah, Ishmael captured them and placed them in captivity. He enslaved them. And who were these people? They were made up at Benot HaMelech, the daughters of the king. And here is where we see that the king's daughters were not executed by the Babylonian conquerors, presumably because they were not considered a threat to Babylon. We had Kol Ha'am and the remainder of the nation, Anisharim B'Mitzpah, that remained in the place of Mitzpah, which is where Gedaliah had set up his new capital, Asher Hifkid Nevuzrad and Rav Tabachim, which at Gedaliah ben Achikam, those people whom Nevuzradan, who was the head officer of the royal guard, had appointed Gedaliah ben Achikam to be their ruler in Mitzpah. Vayish bein Yishmael ben Netanyahu, he captured them. Vayelech lavor al bnei Ammon. Basically, he put his own brothers in chains, and now he's carrying them to his new friend, the king of Ammon, to continue his plan of allying himself with Ammon and bringing the remaining Judeans with him as captives, presumably to give them as slaves to the king of Ammon. Now, the news gets out. How exactly the news gets out? I would theorize, and we're going to see in a minute, that Yishmael had 10 men with him who were loyal to him. It seems that 2 had defected, because possibly, and this is just conjecture, 2 had defected because they saw just how disgusting and how despicable the acts of Yishmael were, and how dangerous they were, and how the acts of this Yishmael were out of vengeance and spite that was going to simply lead to the destruction of the last final remnant of the Jewish people in Judea, that they must have ran to tell the news. And who did they run to? Yochanan ben Kareach, who was one of Gedaliah's supporters. Yochanan ben Kareach was the one who tried to warn Gedaliah that an assassination plot was being brewed against him, but Gedaliah refused to listen. Now Yochanan ben Kareach hears the news about what happened. V'chol sorei hachayalim, and all of the other heads of the various groups of soldiers that were scattered through the land, that were loyal to Gedaliah, asher ito, that were with him, that were with Yochanan ben Kareach together, they heard et kol ha'ra'ah asher asa Yishmael ben Netanya. They heard about all of the evil that Yishmael ben Netanya had done. So now they come to attack Ishmael. Vayikchu es kol ha'anashim, all of the men that had supported Gedaliah, they took all of their men. They gathered as many people as they could. Vayelchu lilachem im Yishmael ben Netanya, vayimtzu'u oso el mayim rabim asher begivon. And the forces of Yishmael ben Netanya and all of the other men who were loyal to Gedaliah met each other and fought a battle at the pool, which is in Givon. Apparently, there is some pool or a lake, a pond, or whatever near the city of Givon. Givon has popped up throughout the history of the people many times. This is a well-known area. This is where they met in battle, and they fought with each other. Vayehi kirod kol ha'am, when the entire nation, who were now being held as slaves, Asheret Yishmael, that were with Yishmael, and they were being dragged against their will to Ammon, when they saw the forces of Et Yochanan ben Kareach, Et Kol Sorei Chayalim Asher Ito Vayismachu, they were happy that they'd be rescued from this awful person, Yishmael, who was leading them to Ammon as slaves. They saw their freedom coming in the form of the army being led by Yochanan ben Kareach and the other officers that were loyal to Gedaliah, who had just been assassinated. By Yasobu Kolam, and all of the people, Asher Shava Yishmael min HaMitzpah, all of the families, these are civilians, these are not soldiers, those are mostly women, children, the daughters of the king, and so on, that they were being let off as slaves. They went over to the other side. They were able to leave Yishmael and go over by Yeshuva by Yochanan ben Kareach and helped and supported Yochanan ben Kareach and his forces. Now, because Yishmael ben Netanya originally only had 10 men with him, now Nimlat, Yishmael ben Netanya, this verse 15, Nimlat escaped Bishmona Anoshim with 8 men. This hints that 2 men had defected, which might have been the source of the news to all of the supporters of Gedaliah. He and his 8 men now lost all of their captives that they were bringing to Ammon, and they're being attacked by forces that are much larger than their own. So they had to run mipnei Yochanan, they had to run from Yochanan. It made no sense to fight, and they had to run off to their ally, El Bnei Ammon. They ran to the country of Ammon to try to get protected by the king of Ammon, who was the one who they had conspired with to cause all of this trouble. So now you have Gedaliah is killed. The news has not yet reached the Babylonians, but it's obvious that it will. And the Babylonians are going to be enraged. Nebuchadnezzar is going to say, fine, this is certainly the last straw. I left the governor there, and now they're still rebelling against me. The people knew that even though they were the ones that were loyal, there's no way that they could stay there, and there's no way that Nebuchadnezzar is ever going to allow a Jewish presence in Judea at all. It's over, it's done. So the people now gathered under the leadership of Yochanan ben Kareach know and realize this. So they need to figure out what to do. So Vayikach Yochanan ben Kareach, this is verse 16, V'chol serach hayalim asher ito. So Yochanan plus the other leaders of the various bands of soldiers that were with him, they took at Kel She'er Ta'am Asher Yeshiv Me'et Yishmael ben Netanya min HaMitzpah. They took the remnants of the nation which they had rescued from captivity that Yishmael had put them into when he was in Mitzpah, which is where Achar Hika et Gedaliah ben Achikam, after he assassinated Gedaliah. Givorim Anshe Milchama, they had groups of men that were capable warriors, the leaders, Yochanan himself, plus V'nashim, the women, V'taf, and the children, V'sorisim, and the other men of the court. Sorisim can sometimes be translated as eunuchs, but it also can be translated as men of the court. We know there were some members of the king's household that had been loyal to Gedaliah, Asher Yeshem Givon, that he brought back from Givon, which is where they met Yishmael, and Yishmael ran off and left off to Ammon. So you have all of these people that are now homeless, leaderless. Well, they have Yochanan is stepping forward as the leader. They know they can't stay there. They know they need an option. They know they need a place to go. They went to a place called the dwelling place of Kimham. Kimham is a person who, back in the book of Samuel, was a friend of David, and apparently the King David gave him and his descendants, land within which to live. Exactly where that is not clear, but it was a place where they could settle safely, and for a temporary to figure out. Asher Eitzel Beit Lachem, it's somewhere near the town of Bethlehem. Lolechet Lavo Mitzrayim, with the plan to eventually go down to Egypt, because they couldn't think of any other place to go where they would be safe. If they stay here in Judah, they're definitely going to be destroyed by the Babylonians. There's no more hope for that. If they didn't want to go into exile into Babylon again, because of a fear that they would be blamed for the death of Gedaliah. So they needed to get away from Babylon, and the only option left is Egypt. So they settled down in this place of Geirut Kimham, which is the land which was given to Kimham and his family, so it was known as Geirut Kimham. Mipnei Kasdim, the reason why they were running to Egypt, this is verse 18, is because they were afraid of the Chaldeans. Remember, Chaldeans and Babylonians you should read as the same people. Ki yaru mipneim, they were afraid ki hikay Yishmael ben Netanya at Gedaliah ben Yichikam, because Yishmael had assassinated Gedaliah, Asher hifkid melech Babel baretz, who had been appointed by the king of Babylon, and they were afraid that they would be blamed for the assassination, and if they didn't get out of there, they would be killed, and the only other place to go is Egypt. So this is where we're left, and soon, in the next chapter, we're going to find how the people turned to Jeremiah, to Yirmiyahu, for guidance as to what to do next. In this chapter, no one has yet asked Jeremiah, presumably he is among the people who were captured by Ishmael and are now being led by Yochanan, and now waiting in this land of Kimham, waiting to decide what to do next. And that's where we're going to pick up chapter 42 next. Thank you so much for studying chapter 41 together. Looking forward to studying chapter 42 and, of course, the rest of the book of Jeremiah together.